Hello, and welcome back to Unhinged Curiosity. I think this is episode maybe 17 now. We are certainly kicking on with this one, and today we are looking at training for strength versus training for size. But as always, voice in your corner. And I always like to start with something a little bit maybe philosophical or something that I've been definitely thinking about this week. And I popped a question to ChatGPT, which I don't often do. And it was, how many times am I going to see my parents before I die if I was to live in Australia? And the answer it gave was interesting. It gave I'll give you the full answer it gave actually. I'll pull it up on my ChatGPT. So, ChatGPT said, if your parents are in their mid-60s, the average life expectancy in the UK is about 83 years for women and 80 years for men. That gives a rough window of 15 to 18 years left, statistically speaking. Now, let's say you visit from Australia once per year. That's 15 to 18 more visits. When you see it in that way, even once a year can feel painfully finite. It's why people talk about the parent paradox. We've already spent 95% of our total lifetime hours with our parents by the time we turn 20. After that, every visit counts disproportionately. Here's the real takeaway. It's not just how often you see them, but how present you are when you do. If you only get 15 more visits, make each one feel like 100. And this was interesting because it also got me thinking around why I feel like I've been in contact more. I spoke to my mom and dad more now that I'm in Australia than I did when I was 30 minutes away. And I think sometimes the distance creates more value and it makes those conversations more valuable. I think it's especially knowing that you can't just have those comfortable contact moments like you can when you live so close. So I just wanted to put that one out there. Maybe it's something that you've been thinking about. Maybe it's something you haven't thought about, and hopefully it kicks you on to spend a little bit more time with your parents. Or obviously, I'm aware that unfortunately some people who maybe listen to this have lost their parents as well. So maybe this just makes you reflect, remember them a little bit, remember them good times that you had. Or if you were in the unfortunate position not to have parents, or maybe you're brought up by somebody else, maybe you think about people in your life who brought you up, look after you, cared for you, and all the wonderful moments you were able to spend with them. Because I think it's something that I've been trying to do more lately is balance work versus being content. And again, the underbelly of this podcast being self-development versus being content. I think this is an important reflection that I've had this week. So hopefully it makes you reflect as well. But this week's podcast is an important one. I'm actually going to do a mini podcast this week. I say a mini podcast. I've planned about 30 minutes to speak on one direct topic, which is strength versus training for strength versus training for size. However, we can or may get carried away. So we'll see how far we get. So I think this is always a topic which comes with a lot of if, buts, maybes. But I think the big idea being that strength and hypertrophy do overlap, and that if you have distinct goals, methods, and outcomes, it's trying to understand the ways that you can train smarter for those goals that you're currently holding, the goals that you're currently training for. So I think just on a personal note, I've been through different parts of my journey and different parts of my story with training where sometimes I've been super focused on bodybuilding, and then I've more so in later life moved into functional strength, hybrid training, and sometimes fluctuated between these two things. So I've been in periods where I trained for a men's physique competition. I was super focused on bodybuilding, which meant it didn't lend itself too much to strength training, and everything was higher volume. Everything was optimized to build muscle, not necessarily to build strength. And I think first, the good thing to do would be to just hash out the definitions of the different styles of training. So strength training, the aim is to increase the amount of force you can produce, i.e. 1RMs, heavy loads, neural adaptations. Hypertrophy training being training for size with the aim to increase cross-sectional area of muscle fibers, so bigger muscles via volume, metabolic stress, and moderate loads. And I think the key point being that bigger muscles can help with strength, but being big doesn't guarantee you're strong. and research actually shows size and strength are weakly correlated, just because the two things, especially as you become more specific and you have more undulation, you've got more years under your belt of training, the crossover is even less. So what are the differences? So I've made quite a lot of notes on these differences just because it can be complex, and I want to make sure that you guys, or you specifically, get the information that you need from this podcast. That, whether you're doing a lift now, whether you're on a treadmill, whether you're on a run, you can apply this to your own training and just give yourself some context, because I think we all go into autopilot sometimes where we are training, doing shit, not really, I guess, optimizing our training for what our specific goal is, because we see other people around us doing different things and we copy them. So we ideally want to be doing both, in my perspective. But, if you want to be as strong as possible, you don't necessarily need to be as big as possible. And if you want to be as big as possible, you don't necessarily need to be as strong as possible. So strength training can be hard if you're looking to be as lean and muscular as possible. They just don't lend themselves. If we think about either end of the spectrum, so we think about a competitive bodybuilder needs to be lean, full, muscular. They're probably the weakest point within their development and within their training cycle. And a lot of powerlifters, you will see, will be holding substantially more body fat, because it helps with performance, it helps with recovery, it helps with hormone production, it helps keep balanced, helps with sleep. And that's why when we look at the either two ends of the spectrum in terms of wanting to be a competitive bodybuilder or a competitive powerlifter, the further down the spectrum we get, the less crossover there is. And I think, firstly, both types of trainers, who train for strength and train for size, will both build muscle. And hypertrophy training, which is kind of optimal of being, between the 5 to 30 rep range, definitely helps with build tissue. But some people will go after these together. Some prefer to go after them completely separately. And that's what we're going to discuss now, which is going to be best for you and what the key differences are. So one of the key differences when it comes to strength training versus training for size is going to be load. So unless you're, Ronnie Coleman, who was a great powerlifter in his time as well, most bodybuilders are not packing on plates on the bar, shooting for 3 to 5 reps, as we mentioned, because it's not optimal for hypertrophy training. So that rep range is going to fall more between the 5 to 30, which is obviously a big rep range. I think the sweet spot realistically for when I'm training for hypertrophy is between 8 and 12, but there is overlap between strength rep range and the hypertrophy rep range being between somewhere like 6 to 8. So there is a slight overlap, but we need to take into consideration either end of the spectrum for building muscle. It's fucking hard doing 30 reps. It's hard trying to really grind that many reps out. It might feel like a death set. And I think you can probably get the same results if you fail in the sort of 12 to 15 rep marker. But, if you want to have some fun, if you want to feel that burn, if you want to bury yourself, then doing some sets of 30 reps can also be advantageous. Right. And in a peak, you may do some tests when you're doing strength work where you're going to go, your kind of benchmark's going to be the 4, 5, 6 rep range. And when you're doing strength training, there may sometimes be places where you will train that 1 to 2 rep range when you're looking at PRs and you're looking at testing. Difficulty being, it's just quite hard to recover from. It's quite hard to recover from those kind of sets where RPs are sort of 9 or 10. And you're having to really take long rest periods and push yourself to your current limits. So it's just something that you've got to bear in mind of how often you are testing, how often you are doing those 1 to 2 rep ranges. So you can train for both when you get really dialed into it, but I just don't think it's advantageous until you get to later stages. A bodybuilder might want to have more well-rounded muscles, so they sort of recruit different exercises as well. Exercise selection is going to be big when it comes to trying to optimize the amount of muscle tissue that you are building, because we're trying to recruit different movements, so then we can recruit different motor units, which is useful, which is not super useful if you are, say, for example, an Olympic lifter, because in a short block, you don't actually really want to get bigger. You want to be super specific. So you want to do things like cleans, overhead things, presses, squats, even maybe lose a little bit of size in a specific block for Olympic lifting or powerlifting. It's not advantageous for you to have as much muscle as possible, and you don't need to have such a big, wide selection of exercises. So that's something we got to think about. And if someone says, I just want bigger legs, there's going to be a different exercise selection if you're in that space. And if you're someone who's saying, I want to optimize the squat, then we need to be looking at, okay, what are those movements that are going to optimize simply the squat? Because there's an element of skill acquisition within that as well, which there isn't in some of the bodybuilding movements, which means we need to practice that said movement a lot more. There aren't many powerlifters or people training for strength who are slamming out sets of lateral raises or kickbacks, because it's just a waste of energy and time for these types of individuals. And that's why we've got to be specific based on what is our goal and what is the stimulus that we need. So I think the thing with the squat, the thing with stimulus to fatigue ratio is where things come in for bang for buck. Squat isn't giving you the most. You're more in danger, you're more under fatigue, and it won't get as much activation if you are looking just to build bigger legs. And this is where, when it comes into then training for strength, the question is, do you want to go specific or do you want to go broad? Because the specific stuff will be the barbell stuff, the 3 big lifts, the bench, your squat, and your deadlift, which is more skill-based, like I've just touched upon. It's very limited in terms of what you can set up within your training regime, and the rep range is a lot more specific because, like we said, it's going to be within that 4, 5, 6 rep ranges, which we need to try and adhere to, because you don't want to be working all the way up to muscular failure, really. It's more so about hitting percentages and rep ranges so that we can become stronger, because powerlifting is super specific. It's not a lot of movement. It's exclusively low rep range. It is very effective, especially if you're someone who likes to work on notes and numbers. However, that's the part that can be complicated, is working on those percentages, especially if you're somebody who's not worked on percentages of your 1RM or 10RM or whatever it may be. And that's the thing that can not be enjoyable sometimes, is that it is so regimented across such a small exercise selection. So you need to think about, when you're training goals, when you're training for strength, can you be that type of individual who is very monotonous and doesn't mind just doing the same things over and over again to try and get linear progression? And the other thing with strength training is that it can be hard to recover from. So you need to have those set specific rest days. Whereas with bodybuilding, if you're just doing upper lower days or push pull legs, you can kind of switch that around depending on how you feel. You might have a big pull day and then go, I don't really fancy doing pull tomorrow. I might just do legs instead because I'm a bit sore. You can be a little bit more flexible with your structure. Whereas when you're training for strength, you've got to be more specific. Those rest days have to be calculated, because it's harder to recover from, which is why sometimes, again, there isn't the crossover that you would hope for between bodybuilding and strength training, because if you're doing big strength days, it's going to have an impact on what you can lift the next day, just because it is way more fatigue and it's hard on the central nervous system and the immune system as well. So just something to bear in mind. So if we go for the broad approach, which is going to be looking at more bodybuilding, it varies in movements. So we can have a lot more novelty with the exercise selection. We can change it a lot more frequently, so it's more enjoyable. We're going to be able to have a lot more variance in terms of rep ranges. Like I mentioned, we can go from anywhere from the 5 to 30 rep range. It's going to be bodybuilding exclusive. The use of big lifts you can do, as long as it's targetedness at the start of the workout. It doesn't have to be as monotonous. There can be plenty of novelty in the split. There can be some progression through different means or any means. Realistically, the main objective of bodybuilding is progressive overload by any means. It doesn't need to be progressive in the format of simply adding weight to the bar. So that's the other big tool that you've got there. And then again, it's way easier to recover from than it is training for strength. So hello there. It's me, Ben. I was going to insert this first quick ad break into the podcast to tell you not about somebody else's product, but about mine. I'm going to tell you about my newest and highest level one-to-one coaching service, which is called the Hybrid Body Plan, which is very fitting for today's episode. And it is the highest level of service that I have offered ever for hybrid coaching and development and systems that I've ever put together to help you, to help other athletes, to help high rocks athletes, whether you're doing your first, your second, your third, whether you're doing your first half marathon or marathon, whether you just want to get jacked, whether you just want to look good, sexy, whether you just want some accountability, whether you need help with mindset, or whether you just want me in your corner every single week backing you with what you have going on with training and you are fed up of wasting time, effort, money, energy for the results that you're not getting. That's what the hybrid body plan is for. So if you want to find out a little bit more about that, if you want to find out what it is like to work with me, or you want to find out more information about the programs and the costs, then I will leave the link in the description to wherever you'll listen to this week's podcast. You can click on that, you can fill in the form, you can find out more about it and see some of the work that I've done with other people. And I will leave that there. And you can ask any questions about it within the comments. And you can even book in for a call with me and the team. Back to the podcast. There's a couple of benefits there. But the place where I did quite a lot of, and I still do quite a lot of now, is trying to merge these two modalities or these two methodologies with training. And I guess you would call that power building. You know, can we train for both is a big question. I think probably most people want to know. And it is possible to merge the two as long as we have periodization in there with training, to making sure that there's certain elements of the training block where it's maybe more focused on strength, and there's maybe elements which are more focused on bodybuilding, and there's taper with it, and there's elements of where we push and moments of where we pull back. And you can have like a strength element maybe at the start of the workout, and then you go more into your bodybuilding work, which I think is probably what a lot of people tend to do. And you can have a main lift within there in terms of the main lift being at the start, and then your hypertrophy training. It's a little bit more well-rounded. But if you want to, if you want a 500-pound squat, it's going to take you a lot longer if you also want big legs, like we just spoken about previously. And if you want big legs whilst trying to get a 500-pound squat, it's going to take longer to get beefy legs because you're trying to split the amount of energy you've got across two different things. So again, bear it in mind. And I think the answer when looking at can we train for both is definitely yes. But I would say start with the strength focus at the start of the session. Start with that bench press, that squat, that deadlift, that 3 to 5 rep range. Then go into your accessory work and performing those with machines and dumbbells and cables, which can even be related to some of the strength movements. And then if you're strength, you might go from, if you're more strength focused, you might want to look at, okay, something which has a little bit more carryover, which is going to help your squats. If you kind of lean a bit more toward the strength quarter. So you might go from doing squats into hack squats go into doing hack squats after squats instead of doing leg extensions, because it has a bit more carryover to the squat because you're doing a similar movement. And then go into hypertrophy work and progress loading your cables and stuff from there. And you can also use mesocycles. So this is just something else I've made a note on. So what you might want to do is you might do cycles of hypertrophy work or cycles of strength work for 2 to 3 mesocycles. And then week 1 to week 3, there might be a recovery stage after strength where you do a little bit more bodybuilding work after you've done your strength cycle. And that's the way that you can sometimes get both elements in there without them being in the same weekly split. It just might be in a slightly different cycle, and you kind of go through those in order to build both size and strength. But if you really want to dial into one or the other, you're thinking about, I really want to just focus on my strength at the moment because going into my hybrid stuff or my high rock stuff, that's my main goal. So that might be an option for you. Or there might be a point in which you're going, do you know what, I'm strong enough. I also want to look good whilst I'm doing my hybrid training. I want to look sexy. I want to have that 6-pack. I want to hold a little bit more muscle tissue as well as having strength, because I don't just want to move well. I also want to look good, which I think is a big thing for self-confidence. So which should you pick? And whenever you do something new, you will always get a kick. Like whenever you decide to change something, there's always going to be an impact on how quickly your progression is. And I think when you look at how do you progress it, this is the most important thing. Because right at the start of your journey, so say for example, when I went to the gym when I was 16, I just wanted to get bigger. I think most people who are going into the gym as beginners, it's best to start with bodybuilding movements because you're still going to get stronger from doing the bodybuilding movements, yet you're also going to add on a lot more muscle tissue. I think if you go straight in and do strength-based exercises and movements or splits, when you haven't really built that mind-muscle connection, when you haven't built the coordination to be able to handle the barbell work specifically, because it is a bit more skill-based, then it's going to be more difficult for you to then build muscle. And building strength during that period when you first start can be quite difficult. I remember being stuck on the two biscuits on the barbell for a long time when I was 16, 17, so 60 kilos. It took me a long time to move past that. It took me a lot of learning before I was able then to build more strength and build more muscle first. So I'd say definitely as a beginner, you're best chasing more of a bodybuilding focus split and getting stronger through the hypertrophy rep range before you then get too specific with the 3, 4, 5, 6 rep range. I think the more advanced that you get, or the more specific you want to get towards becoming a power lifter or strength lifter, then after doing the bodybuilding stuff, you then move into the strength stuff. That would be my personal opinion. That's something that I do a lot of my clients as well, and it seems to work really, really well because size increases quickly at first for newbie gains, so strength gains plateau fairly quickly. So I would say for most, start with bodybuilding, and then I think globally, bodybuilding is just great for overall development. I think it's a great thing for people to first start with. And then when we look at training volume, the next thing. Sorry, I'm just drinking a coffee. What time is it? 2:45. I always try and get all my coffees done before 3 p.m. So we're touching the line on this one. So training volume. Again, when looking at a training block, what you'll often notice is that with bodybuilding workouts will look like a shit ton more volume because of total sets and reps, but it usually with strength training, that's more fatiguing due to how hard you have to push and energy exerted. That's the one thing you got to think with volume is, although on paper, you'll look at a bodybuilding session and think, that's really long. Rest periods are going to be shorter. The actual lift is not going to be as taxing. So the workouts will probably take a similar amount of time. Even strength sessions may take a little bit longer, even though they are on paper look shorter, just because the total rest periods needed for you to recover from those kind of sets in the 3, 4, 5 rep range is going to be a lot longer. It's like I met a sprinter the other day who was training on the track. She was just doing 100, 150 meters and she was taking 8-minute rest times between each one. When you're training for those performance-based metrics where you're really pushing the RP super high, you have to take longer rest periods. And that's the best way that you can then build because everything's optimized for you to get as strong as possible. And when I look at my training block and it's just got bodybuilding sessions and I'm like, thank God for that. I needed an easier day. But I think when you come from strength training, those bodybuilding sessions can feel a little bit easier on yourself and you can pull back a little bit and just focus on form and focus on getting a pump, which again, I think we all like to do at some point. Like now I'm focused on both performance and trying to look as good as possible. So I want to try and do both. And there is a bit of a mixture in both in my current split. I think one of the other big differences is how load changes over time. So in a bodybuilding sense, the reps range is often the most important thing, along with tempo and how heavy we can make the weight feel. So that's a difference. How heavy can we make the weight feel in bodybuilding, whereas we want to try and obviously make the weight feel as light as possible when we're powerlifting so we can get big numbers and it's more bang for your buck. But if we look at the strength block, and a big emphasis is on change in load and percentages. You take the bread and butter, the 5-3-1 method, and the percentages and loads change every week in order for you to PR in week 5, and then the load changes again from there. So it's a very different means of progressively overload. Whereas I think the most obvious, simple progression of bodybuilding training is, kind of lift a little bit more than I did last time, and it's a little bit less structured, and a little bit more broad. It's always, I think, always start with the minimum effective volume, and that's where people get bodybuilding sessions wrong. You'll probably hear me say this a lot of times, more bang for your buck. We don't need to be going in and chucking a load of volume. I think Jeff Nippard's actually just done a 100-day study where he cut all of his training volume by 50%. So I think he just went in and did one set of every exercise, but that set was taken to complete failure, and he maintained the amount of muscle that he had over that 100-day period. And the one thing we've got to remember with that is that it doesn't take as much training volume to maintain size as it does to build it. That's an important thing. If you've got to take rest or if you've got to take time off when you go on holiday, you don't need the same amount of training volume, the same amount of sets and reps and exercises for you to maintain. You can pull back a lot. You can even just do like what Jeff did and do one set per exercise and even experiment with that. And the thing you can obviously build in with that is that's where RP is really important. There's not many people who really take things to absolute failure. And that's where you can play around with and test yourself with the one set is how can you find real failure? And that's where even maybe rest pause comes in. You think you've hit failure, you take 3 to 5 seconds rest, and you go again and see if you can get another couple of reps. And that's taking things to absolute failure. And that's hard work. But I think it's a good test for you both mentally and physically to see where you can take your body, because you only have one set to do. It's not like you've got to go again and again. It's just one big set. Which is, the big thing. So how often can you train in each modality? So hypertrophy training, you can train even when sore. You can go in and you could do chest again, or you could do arms again with little DOMs, and generally we'll recover quicker and we can train muscle groups more frequently. More so because the central nervous system and the joints are usually and generally should be in a good place. So with bodybuilding, it's a little bit easier. With the strength, you will need, like we mentioned, a lot longer recovery, and adding more sessions in will often hinder, not help, the strength training block. So sometimes when you're doing a strength training block, you'll only be able to get away with 4 intense sessions, where with bodybuilding, you could probably train every single day and it wouldn't affect things too much as long as you're on a good and adequate calorie amount. That's why, again, with things like powerlifting, elbows, knees, all those kinds of things, they start to take a bit of a hammering, which is why you'll see a lot of people use the knee sleeves or the elbow sleeves, is because we're putting a lot of load through the joints, again, which is different from bodybuilding. So the big question is, how hard are we training for each, and how can we marry it, because they require different frequencies. So one of the things I've just noted down here is, in a practical example, how to program and periodize both. So what you need to do is decide your primary focus for that phase, i.e., an 8 to 12 week strength block, and then maybe an 8 to 12 week hypertrophy block if you're a beginner is a way to focus this. You might want to go down the more hybrid model, which is going to combine both into a weekly split, which is what I do. So you might do 2 heavy strength sessions plus 1 to 2 hypertrophy sessions. So you got 4 lifts in there for the week, and then accompanied by any bike work or running work that you're going to do. So a sample of this might be day 1, you might do strength, you might do squat, deadlift, heavy with 3 to 5 reps, any accessory work. Then you might do day 2 is a hypertrophy day, upper body session at 10 to 12 reps at higher volume. Then you might do day 3 as your conditioning day, run, bike, or some kind of erg work. Day 4 may potentially be strength, again, work on your press and your pull movements. And then you might do day 5 as hypertrophy, where you do legs, so lower body, and some accessory work. And then day 6, you might do another endurance session or hierarchy-based style session. And then day 7, take your rest and recovery. And that would be a pretty good hybrid split if the focus is for you to get stronger or bigger, and you don't need to focus too much on running at the moment. That's the way that I would kind of roughly run things out. It's sometimes how I will run splits with clients who are coming in with that sort of goal focused in mind. Now, I don't want to go too much into nutrition in this episode, because I think the main focus is for us to just kind of get the idea of the difference between strength training and training for size, and hopefully we've got a good overview of that. But nutrition and recovery are obviously going to be really important. If the focus is strength, I think it's going to be even more important to ensure we've got sufficient protein and we're in a calorie surplus or we're at a maintenance. Whereas if the focus is only hypertrophy, we can get away with being in a deficit and running a recomp where we're looking to build muscle and lose body fat at the same time. I think it's really difficult for you to try and build strength whilst also losing body fat. Not impossible, but difficult. And this is the thing which, again, work on with a lot of clients, is we're trying to look at the different elements of health, performance, and aesthetics. We're trying to get ourselves somewhere in the middle of that goal set. It requires different phases of work, different periodization, different mesocycles for us to really be able to get the most out of each one. I think sometimes trying to attack a multi-pronged approach sometimes and often makes you great at nothing and shit at everything. That's not a bad thing either. I often am not great at anything. So it can just depend on what you're training for at that time. Obviously, at the moment for me, I've done a lot of bike work, and that's been a big focus. I've got a bike session today, which is really, really difficult, which means I'll sacrifice lifting as much. I'm only doing 2 lifts at the moment because I've got a lot of bike work in there until I get surgery. And the other big thing, which is super important and even more important with strength training than it is for bodybuilding, is your tracking. So tracking through strength training has to be really spot on because it's going to dictate for the next block after you've done testing where your percentages for your lifts are at. So your 1RMs, tracking volume lifted, tracking measurements, it's going to be really important. So if you are strength training, that's the primary focus. Having a notebook or an app where you can log stuff is going to be really important. So try and get that one in there as much as you can. I think for me, it's got to come down to, and more so now where I'm not super specific with training, I have to have an element of things that I enjoy in there, which is why I have to have exercise in like, a cable fly or cable bicep curls, which may not have as much carryover to functional day to day or the strength stuff. But the big thing for me is also I want to look good naked. I want to look good on the beach. I want to look good with my top off. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It's not a vanity thing. It's just that I feel good in myself when I have a little bit more muscle. And people have those aesthetic goals, performance-based goals. They can all be tied into one, but they don't have to be. There can be different times in which we train for each individual thing. And again, I know a lot of things that I say today can be confusing, but I think the main thing is that you have to start off with, what is my primary focus during this point where I'm at with training? Is it like high rocks or a competition or a marathon or a powerlifting meet versus do I at the moment kind of not have much of a focus on events or performances? There's no pressure on that. So I actually just want to go in and get a lift, enjoy a bit of bodybuilding movements, look good, get a bit of a pump, and maybe be able to do some shorter workouts. That's fine. I've got a client at the moment who's just had a child, and we pulled a lot of his workouts back to be shorter, and they can be 30 minutes, 40-minute sessions, and they're a little bit more bodybuilding focused to time over because he needs to have energy to look after his newborn. He needs to have energy to look after his wife and support his wife after just giving birth to a beautiful child. And these are things to take into consideration when we're programming for training as well, because we're not all professional athletes. In fact, many few of us are professional athletes, including myself. So it's about programming things that also fit in with our lives. So hopefully today's podcast, this little short episode, was helpful. I actually have some sad news, which is that we're going to be wrapping up this first season of the podcast very soon. So I think for me, like I've said to you before, is that it often feels weird me just sat here or stood here today speaking into a microphone and looking into a camera and there being nobody there. I know that you're on the other end listening. So if you can, it'd mean a lot to me if you can pop any questions onto Spotify or YouTube. And if you do have questions about today's podcast or anything you're unsure of, I'm more than happy to jump into the comment section, have a chit chat with you and help. And again, the other thing that you can do if you want some more help and support with your own training, your own journey, is I will leave in the description to wherever you listen to the podcast. You can actually fill out a form, and the form will come to me and kind of break down some of your goals. And if you want, you can book in for a phone call consultation with me to discuss what your goals are, maybe where you're moving to next, see if I can support you. And that'll either be with myself or with my assistant, Holly. We've just had a crazy influx in people joining the hybrid body plan, which the system's kind of set up a lot around talking about what I have today. So if you want to get more involved in that or find out more about it, feel free to either book in for a session or you can email me, which is benji at hybridbodyplan.com. I'll leave that email in the description to wherever you listen to. Or you can just, if you can share to somebody else who you think would be useful for, or you've taken anything away from today, tag me in your stories listening to the podcast. I love seeing those as well. It's great to see you guys all benefiting from this podcast. And yeah, be a few more episodes. We've got one or two great guests lined up. One particularly is going to be based around strength and muscle building, a doctor who is fantastic. and we're going to have a couple more experts on before we wrap up this season. So if you do have a question, if you want your questions answered in the podcast, please make sure that you do off the back of this podcast as soon as possible. And as always, hopefully I'm acting as a voice in your corner and you find some either entertainment or some education from the podcast. And if you do, please leave a review or rate the podcast, because it really does mean a lot for me. And if you do love the podcast, then please subscribe either on YouTube or on Spotify or on Apple, because it helps the growth of the podcast tremendously. Apart from that, I hope you have a wonderful day and a wonderful week. I'll catch you in the next one.